We'll be continuing talking about water in relation to biochemistry, looking more at its chemistry, with specifically the ionization of water. Now, the O and the H bond within a water molecule is polar, as discussed. And due to this, it can actually dissociate heterolytically. It dissociates into a proton and a hydroxide ion, shown here as H plus and OH minus. Now, this dissociation into the proton and hydroxide is rapid and it is reversible within water. You can see the double-headed arrow showing that it does go between the two states. Now, the equilibrium of this is strongly going towards the left, thus the slightly bigger arrow in our double-headed arrows here, meaning that water normally is in the state of the full molecule not dissociated. The extent of this dissociation does, however, depend on the temperature, so you can drive this equilibrium more or less towards the dissociation by changing the temperature. Now, protons, as shown in the previous slide, H plus, do not just exist freely in solution. They're actually immediately hydrated to form what we call hydronium ions. So realistically, we're forming a hydroxide and a hydronium ion when cleaving water. The hydronium ion is an H3O plus. It still does have that positive charge, and you can see essentially a water just picks up that proton to form this ion. Now, the covalent and hydrogen bonds within this hydronium ion are quite interchangeable, and this actually allows for mobility of protons in water. We call this proton hopping. Protons can move rapidly between water molecules, as shown here. You can see the hydronium ion at the top with its covalently bound hydrogen that is then forming a hydrogen bond between another molecule of water. This can then quickly become a covalent bond, moving on to the water, and that process just continues to occur. This is again called proton hopping and allows for very rapid movement of protons from one area of water to another. Now, the ionization of water can be described through an equilibrium constant. Remember that this is just describing the equilibrium of products and reactants. In this case, we have water in its full form, H2O, and the products, its dissociated form, the proton and the hydroxide. So our equilibrium constant, our KEQ, can be described as products over reactant, so our proton and hydroxide over the full water molecule. We actually know KEQ for water. It's been determined experimentally, and it is about 1.8 times 10 to the negative 6 molar at 25 degrees Celsius. Remember that this can change. We can shift this by changing the temperature. That's why the temperature is listed here. Now, there is another description of water that is more focused on understanding the products within water. So if we're interested in just knowing how much concentration of water is the proton and the hydroxide, so this is kind of looking at the general state of the water in its dissociated products, we can use something called KW. This is mathematically just KEQ, that value that we know, 1.8 times 10 to the negative 16th, times the concentration of water, which also is known. So if we just move this here in our equation, multiply it by KEQ, we then have isolated just the concentrations of the proton and the hydroxide. So Kw was what we call this whole KEQ times concentration of water. Kw is equal to just the concentration of protons and the concentration of hydroxide. Again, this is to focus on how much of those products, those dissociated products, are present. So in pure water, because we know the KEQ of water and we know the concentration of water molecules in their full state, we also know that the Kw of water is 1 times 10 to the negative 14 molar squared. This allows us to understand the normal ratio of hydroxide and protons that exist, again, in pure water, and this is at 25 degrees Celsius. So in pure water, if combined, the hydroxide and, the protons and the hydroxide equal 10 to the negative 14th. That means that individually, each one is 10 to the negative 7th, because 10 to the negative 7th times 10 to the negative 7th equals 10 to the negative 14th. And we assume that there's as many protons as there are hydroxides, since water is splitting into a proton and a hydroxide, one each every time it dissociates. So these are where these numbers come from. This is how we have understood the ionization of water, and thus know that in pure water, there should be a concentration of protons that's equal to 10 to the negative 7th, and a concentration of hydroxide ions that's also equal to 10 to the negative 7th. We also know that generally, the concentration of these two to stay at equilibrium have to multiply to equal 10 to the negative 14th. So even if one, the protons or the hydroxide, is altered in its concentration, the opposite will reflect that change to still equal 10 to the negative 14th.